Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Farmers Weekly's Succession webinar. I'm Susie Horn, Farmers Weekly's business editor. My brother's farm in North Yorkshire, and I've been writing for Farmers Weekly for most of my working life. Coronavirus certainly hasn't made succession planning any easier, and sadly, it'll have forced the issue for some families. They'll have had to make decisions quickly and under incredible stress, often with family members at distance from each other and from their advisors. Many thanks to our panel for their time tonight. We're in good hands because they've got masses of experience in advising on all aspects of farm succession. They are Mark Chatterton, Head of Agriculture and a partner at accountant Duncan & Topliss, Jeanette Dennis, a partner with Ashton's Legal, David Penny, who's Chief Executive Officer of Chartered Financial Planner Penny Financial Partners, and Chris Turner, a partner with land agent Carter Jonas. Each of them will make a short presentation and then we'll open things up for discussion. You can ask a question at any time by typing it into the box at the foot of your screen. Then I'll direct them to the panel. Don't hold back with those questions, whether it's on a family matter, finance, legal, tax, or any other issue. We'll also be running a couple of polls, so please submit your answers when those appear on your screen. The webinar is expected to last for about half an hour, and afterwards it will be available on demand and you'll be emailed to tell you when it's ready for viewing. So let's go straight to our first speaker, Mark Chatterton from Duncan & Topliss. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Good evening, all. I'm from a farming family, gained an agriculture degree and have been an accountant now for 30 years, specialising in the farming industry. There are 350 of us in Team Duncan & Topliss, and 30% of our work is agriculture, with nearly 1,000 farming clients, mainly in Lincolnshire and the East Midlands. All are family businesses and all need to talk about succession. It's not just about tax. There are many successful successions that are never talked about, and you should all strive to be in this category. Communication all the way through. It can take 30 years to fully implement. I suggest you hold a regular meeting to discuss succession, not all the other day-to-day issues. Some say talk about succession as often as you talk about the weather. I doubt that will ever happen. So why do people find it difficult? Money, trying to be fair, trust, loss of control, land values are so high, siblings, and many other issues. For the older generation, it's all about stepping back and losing control. It's going to happen anyway, so try to plan for it. Try to normalise the discussions. Have communication on a regular set timetable, maybe 4 times a year, and always set a date for the next meeting in people's diaries before leaving. My next point is being fair, if not exactly equal. You don't need to be exactly equitable to be fair. You have to recognise a sibling's involvement in the farm, some more than others. The farm may be worth £4 million, but that's not its earning capacity. A fair split may be 2 million to one farming sibling and 1 million each to the other 2. If the farming sibling was to sell up in the next, say, 10 years, the other siblings could have a clawback. Often assets are built up outside the core business and these can be left to a different sibling. Every situation is different. Having a typed family strategic plan, clarifying responsibilities, and putting a date on when the younger generation may take over in full. Minute the fact that parents' wills have been read and agreed by all, and use these meetings as an opportunity to explain why you're leaving things the way you are. So my next slide is short term, medium term, and long term. These will differ, so I won't give examples tonight. The next slide is the management structure should also be typed up and defining roles and responsibilities. Document the training needed by the younger generation and get commitment from the older generation. My next slide shows housing, working hours and pay, and all of these need agreeing in advance. Housing, decisions on this are vital. Often they just happen as opportunities present themselves, but care is needed. A wise person once told me the younger generation should not live within sight of the older one. Everybody needs their space. And people also need to own something, and I recommend this to be their own home. Too many houses in farming are still owned 3 or 4 ways, which is not ideal. Working hours ought to be documented, and the older generation commit to working so many hours and no more. And finally, pay. Recognise the younger generation's worth in the marketplace. If you've got a 24-year-old sprayer driver who could get 25,000 per annum, he's only being paid 15,000, then that ought to change. But value the perks, value the house, the van, the iPad, etc. in everyone's situation. Okay, as an accountant, I'd better get on some tax and tax planning. Income tax to start with. The younger generation should start on PAYE, employed by the family business. This is the most straightforward, and they should be encouraged to work elsewhere to get experience. As we say, they can come and go with a P45. They can then be made a junior partner on a smallish profit share or be given shares in the family company. These things should be well planned and come with extra responsibilities and contribution to the business. They can build up capital in the business over time, as their allocated profit may be more than their annual drawings. And the aim is to build up capital in your 20s before the costs of children in your 30s and 40s erode that. There are lots of opportunities for tax planning with multi-generational partnerships, but I'm not going to go into any detail tonight. Just beware of the tax band changes and optimise profit shares to minimise tax. So on to the capital taxes of capital gains tax and inheritance tax. Capital gains tax is only payable if you sell or gift something. People still think the rate is 40%, and it may well be again in the future. But at the moment, it's only 20% on land and share sales for higher rate taxpayers and 10% for basic rate people. And it's 28% for residential assets. So that's second homes, buy-to-lets or farm cottages. The 10% rate, if you qualify for business asset disposal relief, which is the old entrepreneur's relief, you can pay tax at 10% on capital gains. So if you've got £1 million of gain, there's a cap of £1 million now. So the first million is at 10%. Anything over that would be at 20%. And you can deduct capital losses and trading losses, and rollover relief is still available. The holdover relief is the most misunderstood tax relief, and I want to stress again, it's very applicable in agriculture. Business assets can be gifted down a generation and holdover relief claimed, so there's no capital gains tax due now. The recipient inherits the base cost of the donor, but it can be used for gifting land and buildings and shares in a trading company. On to inheritance tax. This is payable at 40% on assets owned at death and given away in the previous 7 years. The nil rate band is £325,000 per person, and you can also inherit the unused nil rate band from your spouse, so that's £650,000 per couple. There is an additional private residence relief now of up to £175,000 per person, so that nil rate band could get up to £1 million per couple, but only if the house is left to a lineal descendant and the total estate is less than £2 million. So any land holding over 100 acres will take you over that £2 million and mean your nil rate band comes back to £650,000. There are the IHT reliefs of agricultural property relief, APR, and business property relief, BPR. APR is given first on agricultural value, and then BPR is given on other partnership assets and non-agricultural value. Fields for horses do not get APR, and Google Earth can now soon identify paddocks around nearly all the villages in the UK, so be careful. My last point is to give assets now or leave them in your will. People are living longer. Why do they need to be involved owning and controlling an asset in the last 10 plus years of life? Often these assets are not giving an income because no rent is being received. So we've just got a couple of last slides. Giving now reduces your exposure to IHT and makes your estate easier to deal with. Just want to go to the next slide. And there's no expensive valuations. Claiming holdover relief if a business asset, as I've explained, but there might be a capital gains tax disadvantage because the recipient will still have a low base cost if they're ever going to sell. But it does give control to the next generation, but there might be family disputes or divorces in the future to be careful of. Leaving assets in your will, which is the next slide, most assets will get the 100% APR and BPR. There will be a capital gains uplift, so the recipient gets a higher base cost, being the probate value, which is good if land may be sold in the near future. But it may hold back the next generation, and that could be for another 20 years. The answer is maybe to gift land now that the family have no intention of selling, but keep fields in your own name that may be sold to get the capital gains uplift on death. There are lots of issues, and every family is in a different situation. My last point was there are threats to the tax rules which may come in about the wealth tax. There's been a lot in the press recently about the wealth tax and the removal of APR on the farmhouse. Many farmhouses do not have a high market value, so they need a lot spending on them. So there may not be a need to claim APR on the farmhouse. So that's enough from me. I look forward to the discussions later. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Mark. Don't know if Chris might have something to say about avoiding the need for expensive valuations later on, but we'll see what he says. Thank you very much. So we'll hand over now to Jeanette Dennis from Ashton's Legal.
Thank you very much, Susie, and thank you, and good to see everybody this evening. As Susie said, I'm the lawyer in this webinar, and I'm with Ashton's Legal, which employs about 400 people across East Anglia, and I'm part of a specialist team of agricultural lawyers working across the whole of England. I'm also part of a Norfolk farming family partnership, as well as being a solicitor. And my sister is a teacher in Reading, and she's a partner in the family business too. For 7 years in 1991, I ran the family farm of 197 acres. So I've got some practical knowledge of farm business as well as being a lawyer. And we did have up to 4,000 pigs at one time, but we sold the herd in 91. I wanted to give you that context, as sometimes people are cynical about suggestions from professionals on succession, but a lot like me, and as Mark has said, have this practical side too. I also want to reassure you at Ashton's Legal, we do understand firsthand a lot of your issues in succession planning, especially communication. Now, Mark has touched on the business setup and tax, and it is said that there are only two things certain in life, death and taxes. And I'm going to touch on both today and also do some myth busting. Can we get the first slide ready, please, Laura? Now, most family farms are run either as sole traders or partnerships. So I'm going to focus on family partnerships and how you can use partnerships to gradually involve the younger generation without them running off with everything. And the largest asset for most of you on this call will be your land, including farmhouses, cottages and buildings. And succession planning is looking at how to protect that land, as well as the separate business of farming within the family, and how to pass it down intact to the next generation. So, to the first myth, that land is automatically part of a farming business. It's not. Now, Mark touched on this, and Chris will in more detail later. But essentially, if you have a business, you have to put it in writing that you're putting the land into the business. And that's the law from 1925. Anything to do with land must be in writing. Now, the second myth, that land doesn't include the buildings on it. It does, unless there's something in writing that says somebody else owns the buildings, which you should be careful about with your diversification projects. The third myth, that land automatically goes to the partners and that on death, the person who inherits the land is automatically a partner. Now, neither is correct, unless the landowners and partners agree, and that agreement must be in writing. But you can use clauses in your written partnership agreement together with your will to achieve this. And remember, there's no automatic right for a new partner to join. They have to be invited by the other partners. And the fourth myth, if you don't put anything in writing, there won't be a problem and it won't be enforceable. Now, that is just so wrong. If you're all trading together, you are trading together. But if you've got no written agreement, there will be arguments about who agreed what. And as land is now worth so much, there will be court cases. Now, the fifth myth, that you don't need a written partnership agreement. Well, yes, you can trade without one, but the effect can be disastrous. For example, apart from those arguments, did you know that death automatically dissolves an unwritten partnership agreement? This could mean a forced sale at market value of all the business assets, as well as your business having to immediately cease trading, all at the most distressing time of a death. And if there are only two partners on the death of one, even with a written agreement, there will be a change of business to a sole trader. which mean the bank can freeze everything. And the reason for both these is the legal definition of a partnership under the Partnership Act 1890, and that's a partnership is a business between individuals working together with a view to profit. And yes, that isn't a typo, it is 1890. So if you don't have a written agreement, then you go back to that old act, plus all the vagaries of all the court decisions since then on how or how not the act may work in your case. So get it in writing. And that can be done at any stage for existing or new businesses. And if you're bringing in the next generation, use the written agreement to incentivise as well as control them. Use the written agreement to record what land goes in, who gets the profits out, and if the partners will or won't have a share in the land, because that doesn't have to be automatic. The agreement can also make it clear for each partner what are their liabilities, as well as their shares of profits and losses, as well as voting rights and bank mandate arrangements. All simple stuff, but without there are costly disputes. Believe me, it's better to pay £2,000 now for a written agreement than pay hundreds of thousands in a court case. And I always work closely with accountants on partnership deeds and with land agents on values. And as Chris will cover later, valuing out land is both an art and a science. And this leads me on to my final myth for today, that all farmland is exempt from inheritance tax. Now that's untrue, as the APR relief only applies to the bare agricultural value of farmland and sometimes only part of a farmhouse. And it excludes, as Marcus said, any non-agricultural value of land and buildings. And it's only available if you're farming the land yourself and have used it for the qualifying period. It's not automatic. Your estate on your death will need to prove that your land qualified. But here's some good news. If you do a written agreement and the relevant deeds for the land, then you'll be on the starting blocks to go beyond the APR Mark mentioned and qualify for the much more generous relief of BPR. Plus, if you've confirmed the land within your business, you will also get much more generous capital gains tax relief. And that'll be good news for the younger generation who won't have to find as much money for tax. If you put your land into your business, don't forget to update your will. And the reason for this is if you put your land in the business and at the same time leave part of that land to a non-business partner under your will, that won't work. And I know there's an example of this in the question later that someone's already asked. Now, one practical final tip. I mentioned about death and banks. If there's no written partnership agreement, the bank will automatically freeze the bank account. Avoid this by getting all the partners on the mandate now, as well as in the written agreement. Put a clause in the written agreement to limit who can sign on the mandate in particular circumstances if you're worried. I've done a lot of partnership agreements in lockdown for these two reasons alone, and it has worked. People have died, but their businesses have been able to carry on. Can we stop the slide now, please, Laura? So there are good reasons to get everything in writing. And if you don't, to be cynical, it's good money for lawyers. So try and avoid a court case. And on that happy note, back to Susie.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jeanette. And we're slightly pushing for time, so we'll move straight on to David Penny of Penny Financial Services. You're up now, David. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Susie. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for our speakers so far. Some really interesting content. Yeah, we're Penny Financial Partners. I'm the chief executive of that business that I founded just over 20 years ago. We have approximately 20 people in the team, and we're based both in Shrewsbury in Shropshire and Cheltenham in Gloucestershire. So very much at the heart of rural England, and very much when we did set the business up 20 years ago, it was looking at our community, which is, as I say, very rural. And I think we've got to know that world very, very well over the years and experienced rather a lot. So I've taken a slightly different tack to kind of present on, and that was because actually our world of financial planning does particularly overlap with some of the other areas that you'll be hearing from tonight, and we've already heard from today so far, the accountants and the legal world. But we are in some respects looking at it through a slightly different lens. So if I could go to the next slide, I should say. So what does good succession look like? Well, of course, it's going to be crucial to look at the time when somebody passes away to see where the strategy will take from that point onwards. But we would rather like to bring it forward to now, in fairness. We'd like to talk more to our clients and our audience, our community, about taking action more likely today and getting things very much in place sooner rather than later. And when I say in place, we want to have some progressive conversations with our clients that make it easier to understand the actions. So we want to understand, what does good look like? It's a very simple question to ask, but often it can lead to some quite in-depth conversations. Sometimes the professional world can be guilty of influencing the ultimate outcome, and I think we're very keen to hear from our clients what they want, and that, as others have said already tonight, particularly Mark mentioned, that getting people around the table is one of the first kind of ways of doing that, getting those conversations going. And we believe that the role of the financial advisor is often good at that, to kind of work out what feels right. So yeah, absolutely, ensuring that the farming business will run. Of course, that leads heavily into succession, but it's about trying to see realistically what is coming down the line, and making provision for the current generation, maybe working the farm. That might be the older generation, allows for choices to be made, and I'll come on to some specific provisions, if you like, that might work in that regard. So can we move to the next slide, and I'll pick up on a couple of those more tangible solutions. So if I may, I do want to talk about some words that people probably don't automatically jump to, and one of them is pensions, somewhat still tarnished with a poor reputation. We know for a fact that statistically a lot of people don't like pensions. The fact that actually, if I were to relate it to the farming world, we believe about only 20% of farmers will actually have a pension contract, an authorised pension scheme in place. That's not a million miles away from the kind of national average anyway, but it does highlight an issue. And one of the issues for us there is the dependency on the farm financially would be to provide potentially for, let's call it, the current generation, but also the future generations coming in and taking on the farm. So we're almost relying, one would think, too heavily on the family and the assets to look after at least two generations. Where a pension comes in, or provision, doesn't have to be a pension fund, but they are very, very tax efficient. Just may I add to that some people, if they haven't looked at pensions in the last few years, ought to look again, because they really have, for me, changed so much for the better. Even when I've had cynical feelings over pension funds, they really are, from a tax perspective, the best, I would say, they've ever been. So please don't rule them out. But what you're really doing by pension is removing some dependency on the business, on the farm, and allowing for maybe the current generation, as I'm describing them, to consider actually moving away even from the farm. So you're almost subcontracting out the problem of financial dependency. For me, that's a really big point that I wanted to make. Like others, I wanted to make the point that planning for today really does allow for many other options. Life is, as many will know, for living. Lots of reflections in lockdown have been made by all communities, all people, not least, I'm sure, the farming world, as to what the future may look like. So again, getting around the table, discussing together what plans may look like, we believe is quite sensible. I also said I'd touch on a couple of others. I think most people are more fond of ISAs than pensions. Interestingly for me, that pensions in nearly all cases for somebody under the age of 75 are nearly always going to be a better solution. But ISAs definitely have a place. And again, the tax efficiency, the tax-free nature of an ISA makes those really attractive. The thing is, I'm mentioning products, and that might switch people off, but they are ultimately wrappers, holding places for your assets. And I think most people would agree that tax efficiency must be a priority for people, particularly again in the environment that we're in now. The government will have to look at legislation in the future, and there's been even some updates today coming out of the Centre for Policy Studies, put some reports in. I'm going to move on a bit, if I may, to slide 3, because it does pick up on that point of, sorry, can I go back? Sorry, slide 2 still actually has a point I would like to make. The role of life assurance, if I may, just pick up on that. Again, another product. So, but I think tangibly, you may be looking out there as an audience for some solutions to be at least highlighted that might be possible. The role of life assurance is quite valuable, really. Again, it's about risk management, but ultimately it could be about the problem that Mark referred to, in so much as if there were to be a provision that when you're splitting the assets that isn't necessarily equal, the belief that fair is okay. It's okay to end up with fair. But one way of addressing an imbalance, if the farming assets pass through to the farming inheritor, one way you can look to seek some sort of equalization or seek to get the fairness back, if you like, is to set up insurances, life insurances that pay out in a tax-free environment on death, creating capital that wasn't there previously to address the issue of some degree of financial outcome that would be agreed to be appropriate. I mean, you could literally quite simply do that to create an equal outcome, but that's not always the point. Perhaps just some form of recompense, if you like, for or adjustment for the fact that the highly valuable farm does go to a given individual. So back to that slide 3, I said I'd just kind of come more to the end. I'm still talking about tax, but of course we are financial planners and we want to kind of put that into the context of a good financial plan. The landscape is changing. I referred there for the Centre of Policy Studies coming out with some commentary today about what the tax landscape could look like across the board, some of the approaches that may be taken. But we've had several things occurring over the last few years, and we know for a fact that some of the intended kind of directional tax changes may have well been kicked down the road for a little bit longer. There was an OTS Office of Tax Implication review done to review IHT in particular, and that came up with some suggestions, some of which would be helpful, some of them wouldn't be particularly useful for most people and not least farming. They were addressing some of the imbalances of inheritance tax that may felt to occur, and there were some recommendations, particularly when it got to the what's described as the all-party parliamentary group. They put a report together that highlighted again some issues that, you know, when it's all-party, it felt like it had substance, and they were addressing things like the interaction between capital gains and inheritance tax, maybe not allowing for a position where assets are uplifted in value for capital gains tax on death. So there's a few techie things in there, but I won't address too heavily. But we are concerned that at some point the landscape probably will change. I think that feels fairly inevitable, but none of us should be speculating too heavily what that might look like. So forgive me, I did a bit of tax talk, but hopefully also our ultimate aim is to reduce the reliance with some of our solutions on the farm and create a really good outcome for the whole family over many generations. And on that note, I will hand back to Susie, if I may.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. And yeah, lots of food for thought there. And I'm sure we'll have more in Chris Turner's presentation from Carter Jonas, Chris Turner, who will start now and perhaps talk also about some of the very practical on the ground aspects of taking over. Thanks. Thanks, Chris.
Good evening, everyone. Farming and the world is changing. Life is not as we knew it. Trade deals, lower BPS support, increased environmental management pressures, rewilding, technology, and flexitarian are all about to change the way that farms are managed. Succession has always been an issue, but now, probably more than ever, it's becoming more of an issue because of what's on the near horizon. Jeanette has already said that there are three things certain in life: birth, death, and taxes. All drive succession, and whilst tax is very important, it should not be the most important thing. There is a high risk of families falling out when talking about succession, so take your time and understand things. Communication is key. It's never too early to start. You can't do enough of it. And remember to keep communicating. Even when there's a plan in place, things change. Someone needs to start the conversation. Younger generations feel bad about asking about life after death. Older generations may not realise that the issue needs to be talked about now. I would argue that you can't start early enough. You need to understand everyone's objectives. They may all be different. Your kids may not want to take on the farm and simply sell the assets. How do you know unless you ask the direct question? Don't make assumptions. The thought of debt and uncertainty with a limited financial return may not be as attractive as you think it is. Selling farms is not the most tax efficient way of passing down assets, but if it stops an argument, if it keeps a generation talking, then surely it's worthwhile. I've seen grudges in farming families last a lifetime, and these should be avoided where possible. Alternatively, kids who live and work in London may be waiting for the day when you're ready to hand over the reins, but don't want to be seen to be pushing you out, so haven't said anything. Different generations are likely to have different objectives, and you need to understand these to avoid conflict. Older generations generally want to minimise tax and are less worried about generating income. Younger generations may be less concerned with tax and more interested in generating higher incomes, so that presents a conflict. Conflicts also come from splitting assets and value. How do you value a grain store that was built 10 years ago? Is it at the cost of construction? Is it at its depreciated value as written down in the accounts? Or is it the value that someone would pay if they were buying it in the open market? All three options have three different values, so which is right for your situation? It is rare that a farm can be split equally in terms of assets and value and still leave a viable farm. This creates another conflict. As others, everyone knows the score. Work through the issues, as a family ideally, for the possible solutions. Remember, professionals do this all the time, not just twice in a lifetime, so take good professional advice is key. I've seen plenty of examples, as others have already said, where families have avoided a £2,000 bill from the accountant, only to receive an invoice from HMRC for £25,000, and then it's too late. It's too late to do anything about it. Google doesn't make anyone an expert, so please remember that. Stepping up and stepping back, it's no good giving the farm to the next generation and then constantly criticising them on how they manage it. It's no good handing over the farm and keeping the tractor to cut your lawn and then refusing to let the tractor be used to direct drill a field of grass with wheat, when 40 years ago, in a wet autumn, you tried to establish wheat in that field and failed. If you're making the decision to hand over the farm, hand it over, accept what will be, and have faith you've raised your children well. On the other hand, your parents have been in this business for 40 years, and 40 years ago they were going through the same problem of succession. So they might know what they're talking about. And whilst things have changed, be prepared for a lot of I told you so's and learn to bite your tongue. Whilst tax isn't the most important thing, it can be expensive if you get it wrong or don't take any action. There is no point wasting 40 years of hard work to give it all to the tax man at the end. HMRC are getting tougher, so again, as others have said, don't assume that the farmhouse is going to get 100% relief, or that 100% of the value of the land will pass without any tax being paid. Do your diversification activities tip the scales in terms of earned income? Rewilding, depending on its form, is not actively managing or farming the land, so why should it qualify for APR or BPR? Once you've made a plan, keep reviewing it. Things change and you will need to be flexible. Unexpected windfalls may change, and in order to try and keep a balance, the plan might have to change. There are clever things that can be done to try and reduce future windfalls and keep things equal, but you need to talk to professionals. They don't shout about these in articles because often the details are very personal and it doesn't look good to shout about it in front of HMRC. So take advice early. It takes time to get your ducks in a row. It takes time to change partnership agreements and for the cash to follow through into the accounts and for then the accounts to build up into a history of evidence for future tax events. Most importantly, inaction is not an option. If you think it will be hard to raise the issue, ask a professional to plant the seed. It may not appear to go anywhere to start with, but be patient, give it time. Succession takes years. So to sum up, communication is key, and taking advice from specialists who know what they're talking about is key. You wouldn't ask a land agent to connect a solar field to the national grid, so use specialists for what they're trained and experienced in. Talk and keep talking. It's never too early to start, and there's lots of good reasons why now is the right time to start a conversation. Susie, back to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. So we've had lots of advice there. Obviously, communication is absolutely key in all of this, but as any of us who are involved in farming families know, it's not always easy. So I will go to the questions. We've got lots of questions in already. And while people are thinking about or answering the first one, I'll also ask the audience to answer the first of our poll questions, which should be appearing shortly on your screens. So the first question we're going to go to is a tax one, so probably straight to Mark with this one. Someone's asked, if a farm is completely made over to a higher level stewardship agreement, will it still qualify for agricultural property relief? Mark, can you give us a steer on that one, please?
Yes, I think it's all about the word husbandry as far as farming is concerned and the agricultural property relief. And I think if you've got an environmental stewardship scheme, you are carrying out the husbandry. So at the moment, I think those schemes do qualify for APR.
Okay, that's good news. Thank you very much. I think we can't really get into it in any detail now because we haven't got the detail. But I think one thing that's going to be of concern in the future is how, as we go into the ELM scheme, how that will be treated. Some of those options will be treated in terms of tax and the let's face it, fairly generous regime that we have at the moment. Any thoughts on that, or indeed on how if people are allowed to roll up their BPS entitlement into a capital sum as we go towards ELM, how might that capital sum, the payment of that capital sum, be treated as well?
Yes, all interesting questions, and we're not sure. I mean, we are lobbying. There's various tax committees that can lobby the government, the CLA, and the NFU. So I think we will be looking at this in the future and doing our lobbying.
Okay, thank you. And so we will go to the next question, which is, let's have a look. Could the panel elaborate further on how to fairly divide a farm and residential properties between siblings when one is actively involved in the business day to day and wants to take over, and there's another sibling who has no involvement in the farm at all? A situation common in many farming families, I should think. So if we could have very brief answers, if possible, around the panel. We'll perhaps take it in the order of presentations. So Mark first, if you could do that briefly, and then we'll move through the panel. Thanks.
Yes, I think I alluded to every situation is different, and I really don't know where to start, I'm afraid, on that. There'll be some, it's down to people's objectives and discussing them openly, and seeing what comes out of the woodwork, really. But yeah, good luck, and I haven't got anything else to say.
Okay, thank you. If we move to Jeanette then on that one, please.
My gut reaction, Susie, to that is to start off with a family meeting, finding out openly what everybody wants out of this. For example, do the parents want X? Do the siblings want Y? I've hosted quite a few family meetings. I've never ceased to be surprised at what comes out. And often the siblings' greatest fears are never realised because, in fact, the parents want something completely different. So I think I would just say succinctly, assume nothing and have a meeting to talk about it.
Good advice. Thanks very much. And so we move to David on that question, please.
Can we just get the clarity of the question again, please, for me, very quickly, because I've got a thought that was running through my mind, but I just want to be clear that I'm going to answer it. Can you do that?
Yeah, sure. How do you fairly divide a farm and housing properties between siblings when one is actively involved in the business day to day and wants to take over, and there's another sibling who has no involvement at all in the farming business? So this question of fair and equal again, not necessarily the same thing.
But no, I think, Susie, I think it is that we're into, and it was a big theme, I think, today in the run-up that we would address. I mean, simply, you've got to, as everyone said, get around the table and get the right answer for the business, the farm business, to make sure, of course, it runs smoothly for the future, and dividing to put the business to some degree of threat would be not very sensible. And I'm going to lean back to maybe the answer of things like insurance can be used to maybe address the financial consequences of any decisions made. So if it led to an inequality, I would consider insurance being available to buy back some financial capital to allocate to the non-farming individual in this case. But it's devil in the detail stuff, isn't it? You've got to kind of find out what exactly you're trying to achieve long term. I just think that's one way of addressing it. It doesn't have to be insurance, it could be other assets. Hope that
okay,
starts.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. And Chris, I don't know whether you, in practical terms, have seen other solutions on the farms that you advise on.
I don't think there's a solution other than to talk about it. It doesn't have to be an official meeting, but if it's your brother or sister, sit down and talk with them. I've been through the situation where I knew from an early stage we couldn't split the family farm between me and my brother. So we just had to have a sensible conversation about it early as to what could happen, because it was clearly you were never going to split 50 acres in two and either one of us have a viable farm. So an open conversation early and understand each other's objectives and where they're coming from.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So again, back to the subject of communication, which everybody's mentioned and is so important. Thank you, Chris. So our next question is, where do I start with getting an older farmer to start talking about this, presumably the issue of succession, especially about diversifying, if no one wants to go into farming? Which professional should I seek to start the conversation? So I guess that's looking at diversifying on the farm rather than carrying on in conventional farming, but it's a bit of interpretation on that question, so that we've interpreted that correctly. Again, if we perhaps start with, perhaps we go to Jeanette on this one. Any thoughts on that, Jeanette?
I think it's a very good and common problem, because the older generation openly admit in most cases they don't want to start a new sector of their life at the end of or towards the end of their lives. They don't want the risk. But I think what's interesting is a lot of farmers, and perhaps David, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of farmers don't have a pension. And a lot of farmers rely on, say, farm partnerships for monies to keep them when they are no longer actively working, but still within the business. Believe me, please, no farmer should ever retire, and certainly you should never be on the death saying retired. What I think would be interesting is to find out what the expectation of that older farmer is as he gets older, as to how his income is going to be generated. Because you may find you're pushing at an open door. Because as we all know, with Brexit and all the various things going on, farming as we know it is not going to be the same. Raw material production in this country will change. So diversification and sector analysis will become hugely important. And a lot of older people know this, they're not dumb. So I would actually ask some questions, first of all, about where they see they want to be, and then work backwards.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jeanette. Sorry, this one involves development land. Can the panel tell us how to start dealing with land that would be suitable for housing in a nearby village? The land hasn't got outline or full planning permission, and it's going to be inherited by a sibling who's not active in the business and will not inherit the farm business. So this looks like development land in a nearby village is going to be inherited by a sibling who's not active in the business and won't inherit any of the farm business. So slightly involved question there. I think that the questioner is asking, should we be pushing for this land to get planning permission now? And also potentially there's a tax question in there as well. So perhaps we can ask Chris first in terms of possible development potential, and then Mark on the perhaps on the sort of tax and inheritance angles that brings up.
From a development side, if land has got potential for houses now, then it will probably still have it in 5 or 10 years' time, subject to the local plan. So there's going to be a big it's going to be a big capital value when planning permission goes through. So if you're planning to do a transfer, arguably do it before it gets planning permission. So you're transferring at a lower value, and there's a lower capital gains tax to pay, because otherwise you'll end up selling the development land and then you'll have cash to pass over rather than land that's eligible under APR or BPR. So it depends how quickly you're planning to transfer it. And in terms of whether all of that money going to, say, a brother or a sister who then gets a massive windfall, covenants and restrictions can be put in to try and equalise that. So whilst the land may have a value of £10,000 an acre now because it hasn't got any potential, if it was to sell for £500,000 an acre when it had potential for residential, you could have a clause in that when it's transferred to say that a proportion of that, and you can do it with percentages or you can do it at certain figures, will be transferred back to other parties. So it try and equalises out one party getting all the benefit, if that's not a fair way of doing it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point, because I think it's a fear sometimes when people gift assets and thinking that somebody's going to farm that land forever, and they might want to sell it 2, 3, 5 years down the line, and other family members who perhaps hadn't been involved in the business but might have some expectation, have had some expectation from the proceeds of that sale. That can all be catered for with good planning and plenty of thought, in advance. Thank you. Mark, can we go to you briefly on any thoughts on the tax?
Yeah, can I just throw in we're going to get involved in a lot of these on tax planning when there's potential development, and one option is to throw the asset into a company at this stage and then have lots of shareholders being different generations and different siblings, just to share the tax reliefs around. And we haven't mentioned trusts this evening, but obviously that they have a place in tax planning as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Moving on, you just mentioned trusts, and we have got a very brief question, which is trusts or family investment companies, which is best? So we'll perhaps go to David Penny on that one first, and then to Mark.
Come off mute.
Hello, David.
Yeah,
do you want
thank
to... Okay.
Yeah, I should be off it now. Thank you. Just doing that. I think Jeanette actually would have probably an input on this, but on the legal side. But for me, we've seen both these in place. We probably more day-to-day work with trusts by the kind of value that sort of ends up being there. We find them probably a more straightforward structure for holding assets, and the rounded protection. There's a lot more responsibility attached to family investment companies. I say typically you're looking at probably quite high value levels before people start to look at those as a solution. But realistically, we don't set them up in the financial planning world. We lean to kind of the legal world to help that side more or less. So I probably would defer it slightly, if I may, to Jeanette to give a more kind of if she involves herself in that sort of work. That's okay.
Okay, Jeanette, do you want to have a go at that one? Trust for family investment companies.
Yeah, Mark will comment on the tax consequences of the companies and the trust. I think if you are looking at companies, my gut feeling is use the shareholders agreement to make it clear who can own the shares. If it's in a family, how the shares can be transferred around between the generations. And I think this is a point that's often missed, and it should be used more creatively than it is. Trusts are a good vehicle. They're not quite as fashionable as they used to be because the Treasury is quite onto them in terms of the tax consequences. So at the moment, they're not quite as fashionable, but they certainly have a role effectively to move an asset out of an individual's own land ownership, for example, like the development example earlier. I personally, taking the example earlier, think that we should look carefully at partnerships, because putting land by a declaration trust into a partnership is often a very good way to achieve a lot of objectives. But see what Mark says.
Thanks very much, Jeanette, and we'll go over to Mark now. Thank you.
Yes, I think trusts have a lot of history, and they've been used in the UK for a long time. A lot were set up in the 60s and 70s with the higher rates of tax, of income tax. The assets need to be large enough, and these trusts need to be fully explained and understood by everyone to make sure they're used properly. But the family investment companies have also become popular in the last sort of 4 to 5 years with land values going up, and they're flexible as well. So I think it's horses for courses, and with the right advisors, everyone working together, land agents and accountants and lawyers, will get the right solution.
Can I just add to that the stamp duty land tax issue shouldn't be forgotten with companies.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And we have another question. What are the panel's thoughts on land expansion? I think this means just farming expansion generally, where the younger generation are considering expanding, but the assets that are going to be used as security for the borrowing for that expansion sits with the older generation. Should we look to bring forward land inheritance into the younger generation and sit all the risk with that younger generation? And also, is that a good idea at present with land prices as they stand? It sounds like you could probably do with half a day from all of you on this one, but perhaps Jeanette, can you kick off with that one? I think you might be muted, Jeanette. I don't know if it's just my connection, but we can't hear you, Jeanette.
Sorry. No, that's fine. Sorry about that. It's about risk. And I think it's also about what the bank require. And I've done lots of borrowings very recently where the bank is actually requiring both generations, because under the lending rules, if you're over a certain age, and I won't be indelicate, you need to show longevity if you're looking at a longer term loan. So it may well be you first start with what the bank wants.
And Mark, any thoughts on that one?
Yes, I mean, it's a question of the business having a plan. I think having a strategic plan, which I mentioned, and the family having a plan, you know, in all sharing in the vision. But obviously, expansion is good, but it needs to be planned properly. And as Jeanette says, with getting the banks, they will wrap you up and take security from the older generation. But it's if you have a strategy of getting that land down, there are ways of achieving it.
Okay, thank you, Mark. We've got another question here, which I'd like to put to Chris first. Communication is clearly key in developing a successful succession strategy. At what point should a third party be brought into these conversations? Chris, I guess you probably get called into different situations. Sometimes you probably wish you'd been there a few months earlier, or people had sort of expressed exactly what they wanted sooner or more vociferously. At what point do you think a third party can help in talking through family farming succession ideas?
I said it in my talk, I don't think it can be early enough. I think even if the parents, I don't know, if you've just had kids and you think succession is 40 years away, I don't think it's too early to have a conversation with whoever your next professional advisor is that you're seeing, to generally run the principle past them. Or if you're further down the line and your kids are now 40 and you're near you past retirement, near retirement, it can't be too early to have the conversation with a professional, just to see what the latest situations are, what the latest thinkings are in terms of tax, benefits. Every situation is different, so talking early is always a good idea with your professionals. As I said, you can't learn everything from Google. Google doesn't make anyone an expert, so use your professionals, even if it is going to cost money, because it's got to be cheaper than getting it wrong and ending up with a big tax bill, and then not being able to do anything about it because you haven't got your ducks in a row.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Sorry, this is probably a legal one for Jeanette. What's the most common misunderstanding that you come across about wills and gifting assets? And I think you did refer to one, several people did, which is that, the division of assets and whether they're held personally or by the partnership quite often causes confusion. But without me complicating things, perhaps you could just say what that most common misunderstanding is in terms of both of wills and gifting assets.
Absolutely. A lot of people, we recommend that people to move into business property relief, which is a much more generous inheritance tax relief, that they put their assets into a business. And again, I'm just focusing here on family farming partnerships. And the benefit of doing that is that you get the wrapper, the more generous release for inheritance tax and capital gains tax. The disadvantage is actually that if you intend a non-farming child to receive part of those assets, that if by your will you leave the asset to the non-farming child, you have already put the asset into the business. And you could end up with a situation where the child is entitled to the market value of that gift under the will, which then forces a sale of the asset within the business to pay the money to the child. So what we try and do is look at bringing in the non-farming siblings, where the intention of the landowning partners is to pass part of that land to a non-partner beneficiary. So it's all about looking at the will and what everybody wants to achieve and the partnership agreement. Because you can bring in a non-farming sibling and actually, as I've said in my resume, you can actually limit their voting rights, you can limit what profits and losses they receive, you can use a declaration of trust, you can be creative and achieve what you also want with the will. I can't deal with the equality point that we talked about earlier, but that is a practical way of dealing with it, and that's a common misconception, that you can leave an asset twice, by your will and in the business.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we're a couple of minutes over time, but we can go just for a few more minutes. And another question, which I think is going to come up more frequently in future, is how will carbon credits be treated for tax purposes? What's the status of carbon credits with HMRC? Mark, perhaps on this one, first of all, do we know anything about that yet, Mark?
I really don't know. Sorry, I'm going to have to be honest. I have to look at something to look up in the morning.
Okay, thank you. I'll open that out then. I don't suppose it's anyone else's particular area of expertise, but please, if anybody wants to have a go at that one, tax treatment of carbon credits. Any ideas?
I think the key is in agricultural property relief or business property relief. The word property. So if it's not an element of property, an element of land, I don't think it would qualify. That's my gut feeling. If it's within a wrapper of other business assets, it may be within a BPR wrapper, but I think the jury's out on what is really intended.
Okay, thank you. May not have time for everyone on this one, but what's the most common tax or finance oversight in farm succession planning, and how easy is it to remedy? Well, given that Mark's the accountant on here, I'm sure you've all got ideas as well. Perhaps we could just have a quick reply from Mark on that one. You there, Mark?
Sorry, yes. Sorry, most common problem.
Most common misunderstanding.
I think we've covered. It's really is the land owned by the farm partnership or by the individuals. That's what often crops up, and no one really remembers whether those assets were put into the farm partnership or not, or whether they're owned by. They may be on the partnership balance sheet because the borrowing is secured against them. And to get tax relief on the interest, but the assets are actually sit in individuals' names. So clarifying that at the early stages is very important.
Okay, thank you. So one final question to the whole panel: if you could all answer this very briefly, and I know the answer will probably part of what many of you said in your presentations. If you were asked for your single short piece of advice about farm succession planning, what would it be? Mark, we'll start with you as you're on screen already.
Yeah, I think communication, we've always said, but also commitment. I think once you've made the decision, you've got to try and stick with it. I know plans can change and you can be flexible, but I think commitment is needed.
That's great. Thank you very much. And we'll go in order of presentation. So Jeanette, next, very briefly, please.
I think I would say give it time. I this summer completed a partnership reorganisation that we started in 2012. So right. It's never too early to start. and
Right.
it was only precipitated by COVID.
All right.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. And to David next, your brief piece of advice, main advice on succession. You there, David?
Okay, sorry, apologies. My words were start early, that said, and maximum fund your pensions, I would suggest. They are inheritance tax-free and excellent to reduce dependency on various parties.
There speaks a true financial planner. Thank you. And Chris,
Absolutely.
last but not least. Chris,
I think it's all about communication again, starting early, being open and honest, and then being prepared to step up and step back. So if you're stepping up, take responsibility. If you're stepping back, properly step back.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Thanks to all our panel. We've had we've had more questions than we've been able to answer. Thank you all for registering and for attending the webinar. Thanks very much to all of our presenters, and I hope that everyone has gained something from this. I certainly have. And good night all. Thank you.